Hey friends, welcome back to the Invitation Podcast, Season 2, Episode 6. Phil, what's a recap from the last episode?
Yeah, recap from last episode. We are diving into Moses and the story of Moses. Last episode, we looked at the burning bush, and the next couple episodes, we're going to look at some issues of identity that he works through, and I believe that we work through to this day.
All of us. Yeah.
So it's really important to go back and listen to that previous episode. But a quick recap here is Moses is a fugitive. He was born into the Egyptian kingdom and the Egyptian royalty. He murdered an Egyptian for harassing a Hebrew brother of his, and then was confronted on that, and he leaves. And he ends up marrying somebody out in the wilderness and making a life of being a shepherd. And he sees this bush that's on fire. He turns aside. He looks at it. God welcomes him and invites him in. We talked a lot about that last time. And are we willing to turn aside to be invited a little bit deeper into our relationship with God? So that's one key point from the last episode. And then the other part was God was connecting with Moses and all of his passions to see the Hebrews freed from their oppression. And God commissioned him to go back and do it. And are we willing to see ourselves in a light of being redeemed by God and commissioned by him, despite our faults, despite everything else, which leads us right into today's episode. Yeah. Any other thoughts from the previous episode, or shall we dive in?
No, that's good. Let's dive in.
Great. Well, I'll read the tiny print since I've got the glasses on. So this is Exodus 3, verses 11 and 12. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." So we're going to dissect this episode into two parts. The first one being, but Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And Kyle, this is a question as old as time itself, but we continue to wrestle with it, especially in the Instagram age, the social media age. The question of who am I, my own identity. And I teased a little bit there about, social media culture, but any other particular instances or paradigms of this search for identity that comes up in your mind?
I mean, it's such a huge issue. It's one of those things that anytime we're alone with ourselves or in comparison with others, which can happen often, we go back to that and we look to find some bedrock. And I think if there's anything shifting in that, it causes us to feel unsteady. And I think that there's some really good news in this discussion of identity. And we're going to walk through some of those pieces today and walk through some of those thought patterns as it plays out in the story of Moses that hopefully will allow for some pretty powerful reflection on your part, and give some framework to help you work through some of the foundational pieces that not only speak to where you are right now, but where you're going, how you orient yourself with those things, and have a few more tools in your tool belt for examining that larger question of identity.
Right, and I really like what you said about the foundation on that level. There's a reason why this is the first of 5 questions that God asked Moses surrounding his identity. All 5 of the questions will be identity questions, and you're right, will equip us. That's the goal of expanding Moses out into 6 episodes, something we haven't really done before, except for Genesis 1 and 2, of course. But we're always going to do that. Fair warning. And so that foundational piece of who am I, it still is foundational today. This isn't just an Old Testament biblical idea. I would like to propose right away, hard and fast, that especially when we make decisions in a moment out of anything other than peace or security or faithfulness, that we are actually making those snap decisions out of a search for identity, out of a securing of our identity, out of a pushing for identity, a grasping for our identity.
Yeah.
And this passage right here is doing something towards that, to be very vague. And it's so foundational, right? It's so foundational to know not only who you are, right? Who am I, Moses says, but whose you are.
Yeah.
And I'm spilling the beans a little bit on the second verse, which we did read, so you're aware of that if you're listening. But this foundational rock bottom aspect, it bubbles up, it comes up in moments that are not only extreme, but are everyday. And in this passage, the thing that is being highlighted is identity tends to come up when your life is about to make a shift. When your life makes a shift in purpose, a shift in setting, a shift in mission, if you will, a shift in culture, this identity piece needs to be foundational, as well as it just is foundational. I see you writing something down. I was going to see if you had any other thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I like the shift idea, and I think we'll come back to that later, especially as we flesh this idea out over a few episodes. But no, we're right where we need to be.
Yeah, good. Well, I want to piece together a little bit what Moses is wrestling with and see if anything else bubbles up for you and I and for what we think the listener might be going through in their own identity search. But Moses, he likely, we're not told explicitly, which I love.
Of course you do.
It gives us space to imagine ourselves in his shoes. It gives us space to imagine what he was going through, but then put us in those shoes as well of, well, what is it that I'm going through? But Moses likely sees himself as a fugitive murderer on the loose, someone guilty of murder, who is now being asked to go back where he's convicted of a crime, right? I once got a speeding ticket in Maryland. I live in Pennsylvania, and that freaked me out enough to not want to go 20 miles to Maryland. I can't imagine being a fugitive of murder in another country and being told to go back.
Yeah, no thanks.
Right?
Yeah.
So
I think I'll just avoid that, because there's a reason I went into the wilderness and married someone else, and not trying to go back.
Not trying to go back. And the thought of pursuing my passions, the thought of going back and doing something for God is fraught with all sorts of fears, all sorts of bubbling up of what my identity has become comfortable with. I'm comfortable running away from my passions and being a shepherd. Not that there's anything wrong with the vocation of being a shepherd, of being a husband now, right? Like, he's got these other aspects of his life that I'm sure and certain have done something towards his identity.
Yeah.
But there's something underneath all that that's still bubbling up.
And I think what I take away from that, Phil, is we can hide behind an identity that is on the surface good, but potentially you're using that as a mask or a shield that is not allowing you to step into something great. There's a lot of nuance there, but I think that if you're in that situation, what I just said will most likely resonate.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I love about this exact moment of recording this podcast, Kyle, is that for me, 2-ish years ago, you were living in Colorado, and we were connecting on the Marco Polo app. Free advertising for the Marco Polo app here.
But not a paid sponsor. No. Marco Polo, if you're watching this,
right.
But certainly, good way to stay connected.
And I was slowly coming out of 2 chronic health issues and giving you the details on that, and sort of complaining that I didn't feel like I was really living into my purpose, living into things. And you were asking me all sorts of thoughtful questions over that app. And at some point I spilled the beans on, I really have this itch to teach and to speak and to maybe even start a podcast or a YouTube video. And you said, I'm coming back to Carlisle. We should hit record. And do you remember where we hit record?
Shoot, for the first time, was that outside a coffee shop, or was that, where did we do the first? Was it right here?
This very table.
It was. The tester was here.
This very corner.
Right here. We need studio names, you know.
Studio 102.
This is
is what I call it in my head.
I like
an ode to my college days and my
Nice.
apartment. But yeah, it was right here. And what you did for me is you asked thoughtful questions and you gave me an invitation that I wasn't willing to push through myself. I had fears, I had anxieties, I had hang-ups over the health issues that had sunken into my identity and stolen some of my identity. Yeah. And you brought that out of me in a really fun way that sits us both back at this table where we recorded our test episode, which is not hitting the internet anytime soon. It was bad. It was good, but it was bad.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's one way that I have struggled recently in my own identity and found good question asking, good attention paying, like we talked about before, where you had me turn aside and to not only listen to you, but to listen to God on the matter.
Right.
Can you think of any other ways that you struggle with identity questions or that you think our listeners might struggle with identity questions? And any helpful tips for working through that?
I resonate with Moses on this.
Yeah.
You know, I look at my past and I just go, I'm unworthy. I'm unworthy to talk to people about God, what he's done in my life. I'm unworthy to get on stage XYZ or, you know, try to present that I have some tips on, you know, how to live life, you know, at a different level. And you know, there's a whole bunch wrapped up in there. I won't, you know, pull on that thread at the moment, but I think that's the biggest thing. I think there's something in each of us, and I'll you know, say for me personally, I feel like Moses, you know, and that's a direct tie back into this story of there's a juxtaposition between here I am a sinner and also realizing very clearly that I've been designed to do great things. Okay. What's next?
That's great. And that brings us to the second half of the episode really well, where it says, or God says, I will be with you. Yeah. One thing I really love about that part of that verse is God could have said, oh, it won't be you, it will be me shining through you. And I hear that language come up all the time in Christian circles.
Right.
Oh, it wasn't me, it was God. Right. And that's and good.
There's some truth there, but there's some other truths at play as well.
Yes, and it's polite, it's humble. Yeah. So I'm not necessarily knocking that and saying that that's bad or evil or even incorrect.
Sure.
What I love about this verse is God's response to Moses' identity question wasn't so much a pep talk or you got this or on the other end of the spectrum of, oh, don't worry about it, it's going to be me doing all the work and shining through you or all that.
Right.
It was this in-between of, and I will be with you, which is so great. It's so encouraging that our identity doesn't need to be pull yourself up by the bootstraps, earn it yourself, earn your identity yourself. But it also isn't so much that I just fade away. I'm nothing. I'm a nobody. I'm merely a sinner. This goes all the way back to our first 5 or 6 episodes.
Yeah.
Like
big
first
time.
4 or 5 episodes.
Big time.
It's this partnership.
Yeah.
It's this longing for God to have image bearers in the world that walk with him and not away from their image bearing or their vocation. Right. Huge Genesis 1 and 2 moment here.
Well, and I love it. I love that you use the word partnership. It's actually a part of my professional title, so there's a lot tied up in that word for me. But to me, it involves investment from 2 parties, not just one. And so I really like how that plays out in this situation here.
Yeah, great. So that brings us to the second half of this Exodus passage as well as our episode. I'm going to go back over that verse here quick. And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. So I love that God is willing to give a sign. Okay, and if you followed God for almost any amount of time and been in Christian circles, you've probably asked for a sign, given some sort of trouble in your life or a decision that you've made in your life. And we could spend time going over signs that you and I have seen. I'm going to save that for another time, for some testimonial time.
Yeah.
What I want to point out is some of the problems of this verse. Not necessarily, oftentimes it's like, here's what this verse is saying.
Right.
What are the problems with this verse? One of them is, so it says, this will be the sign, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. Kyle, if I sent you down the road to the grocery store, there's a grocery store about a mile down here, and said, Kyle, I'm sending you to go get lemons.
Yep.
Can I also be with you?
In the physical sense, no.
No, why?
Yeah,
because I'm sending you,
yeah.
right? Like, and so, like, if my wife sends me on an errand, she's sending me on an errand specifically so that she doesn't have to go with me.
Right.
I'm the one going. One of the problems here with this response is it doesn't make sense in human terms to be both with and sent.
Yeah.
And God, one of the powerful things he's doing just in that grammar there is he's revealing himself to be very powerful enough to be the sender and the wither.
Well, and what I like about this verse so much is you know, one might see it as problematic, but to me it's a part of this deepening, it's a part of this journey, and again, this is approachable for everyone. So when you read that verse, you're going to get something out of that verse, regardless of if you break down the grammar.
Sure.
But how many times do you think you've read that verse in your life, right?
Yeah.
So there's a deepening. There's a when you walk through a friendship, you don't just stop learning about an individual, right? When you're you know, with a spouse, or you're building a relationship with that in mind, you don't just say, okay, well, I've got it, right? I'm done learning about, you know, Phil, right? We're going on this podcast friendship journey. I checked the box, right?
Right.
I've learned all there is to know about Phil. No, it's dynamic, and it's the same way with this text, with your relationship with the Lord. There's a deepening. So I don't want that to be a stumbling block for anyone. Let's just continue the journey.
That's right. Yeah, it's really good. The journey is going back to our last episode, right?
Yeah.
The journey is where our identity unfolds.
Yeah.
And so one of the points we made last time is our identity ensues from being pursued by him. Yeah. It's not just revealed in a moment. And so we actually need to be sent and feel some distance from God to know that he's there, which I know how that sounds. Yeah. I know it's paradoxical. I also know it's in Scripture. Yeah. It's right here. Here's the sign that I will be with you. I will send you.
Yeah, it's the faithfulness. It's the, I don't know if I touched on this before, but the quick overview there is, oftentimes many have what I like to call a mountaintop experience. Mm-hmm. You know, whether this is at a camp or a missions trip or whatever it might be. And then if you're not prepared for what is going to happen when you step back into your regular day-to-day routines in life, it can feel very lonely. However, if you go in knowing that, prepared, that is a faith builder. Mm-hmm. That is a period in your a period of time in your walk that strengthens and draws you closer in that pursuing, in that strengthening and deepening portion of your faith.
Yeah, which is really great. And it comes back to that partnership piece. My brain is spinning in circles right now because the partnership piece to that is so important. God's part is important. That's what gets fleshed out in the second half of this verse here.
Right.
So this sign comes with a problem. of someone sending us but also being with us.
Yeah.
And what was that sign? The sign was, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Signs are typically the things that we walk through so that we see something happen.
Right.
This sign is, when it happens, then you'll know it was a sign.
Yeah.
And that is so countercultural to our logical Western civilization minds that says, no, that step hasn't come yet. I need the sign first to be able to go out in faith. I need the sign first.
And even stories, right? Look at like major movies, right? That's not how it plays out. Right. It plays out with the you're seeing, oh yeah, this is it. Let's go. Right. There's the sign. Not a, retroactive. I think that there's retrospection that certainly, but when it comes to signs, no, it's very counter to what we're seeing in Exodus here.
Yep, unless you're Christopher Nolan.
There you go.
But so this sign, it says something. It sets Moses up for God's faithfulness.
Yeah.
Right, and the sign is Moses' worship. The Israelites' worship to God. So often it gets in us that we are the ones that are initiating things. It's subtle, but we get into this relationship with God where it's like, oh, I'm going to worship him. I'm going to bring gifts to him, and he's going to be so pleased by it. And we might not say it in those words, but it gets in there. It gets in there of, I'm going to do something to impress God. Moses is clearly not in that posture there. He's like, who am I that I should be sent back to free the Israelites? So he's not there. And God is saying, the sign will be this. When all this comes to happen, when I partner with you, you will worship me on this very mountain. And all too easily, we identify ourselves as Christians by what we do, by what we're faithful to. I am a Christian because I believe X, Y, and Z is super popular in denominational America right now. I am a Christian because I love God. And one of the things that God is doing here with this sign is, I will carry you through this journey so well that I promise you will respond in worship on this exact mountain. Yeah. And I see that as being this a pictorial way of building this identity question even deeper in Moses, where it's like, I will bring you back to this very mountain where we discussed your identity to confirm your identity, and your response to me will be worship. Yeah. It won't be a thing that you do. You won't worship to get a response out of me. Your response to me and my faithfulness will be worship. And I will remind you of that because it'll happen right here. Yeah. I love that, right?
There's so many layers there. That's fantastic.
And I've already given you the example of, like, I'm experiencing it right now in the recording of this episode, of this boosting of, oh yeah, God has partnered with me to bring out my voice, to bring out what he has taught me. And even though that might sound prideful on the surface, it's so challenging. I'm constantly overcoming anxieties, health issues, like that. And he's calling me to moments like this where it's like, oh God, you are carrying me through this. I'm partnering with you. I'm being faithful to you, and hitting record and drawing up episodes.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, none of this is typically going to be easy. Should your giftings come to you naturally, oftentimes we'll see that. Yeah. But there's how many good stories do you see a protagonist just stroll their way to greatness? Right. So keep in mind here, and I've said it before, I'll say it again. Never want to give the enemy more credit than he's due, and also realizing that opposition exists, and if we realize that, we can expect some resistance to walking out our powerful identity. And I think that's worth saying here especially in the light of your story,
Sure.
and struggle getting to that powerful place that you're still walking into.
Yeah, really well put. I'm so glad you brought that up because I didn't have it in my head or in the notes here for our episode. But last episode we talked about the burning bush, Moses, God's presence,
Yeah.
tree of life, and
Yeah.
a test.
Yeah.
And part of that test was the serpent, and the serpent is missing from this.
Right.
There's
right.
no
There in the tree of life, not there in the burning bush example.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so the serpent is missing, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's the serpent isn't missing because of the challenges, the temptations that Moses is feeling. That
Right.
is the serpent Moses' walk, and
Right.
we have our own serpents.
Right.
We have our own, little devils on our shoulder.
Well, and think about it,
opposing us
right?
too.
Like, what's the alternative? It's not like Moses has this choice of like, hey, you're gonna die, or go rescue my people. The alternative is, hey, go rescue my people, or live a nice, quiet life with your bride that you're very comfortable with on this land. So, yeah, there's a huge temptation to just be like,
yeah.
I'm good.
And
Right?
the way you just put that helps me realize that is life and death.
Yeah. Shoot.
Moses would just die, not physically.
Yeah.
He would die inside.
Yeah.
We would say in today's language,
Yeah.
we would die inside if we just stayed the course
Yeah.
of where life is.
To take the Thoreau quote, right?
Yes.
Most men
good.
lead lives of quiet desperation, right?
Yeah. And again, that's not saying that marriage and shepherding and those jobs and vocations are dying or bad or evil. It's this relationship with God part where we know something.
Right.
We know
Right.
something of where we're being pushed and where God's calling us, and we know something of our identity, but we're refusing it, we're doubting it.
Yeah.
We are anxious about it. We might feel under-equipped about it. I'm spilling into actually some of the future questions. But one of the invitations that this passage is making is to recognize those anxieties, recognize the shortcomings, recognize the failures of our past or the circumstances that we are walking through, and saying that God is still with us. That with us part is supposed to be so formational to our identity.
Yeah.
And everything about our identity. So take any aspect of your identity that you are wrestling through and ask God, where are you with me in this? Because sometimes those wrestlings and those questions, those doubts feel like distance, right?
Yep.
And we like to just logic puzzle our way through these sort of questions when really they are a feeling question. And if we stop trying to logically see God
Yeah.
and say, God, I don't feel you here. I don't recognize you here. Where are you with me in this struggle?
Yeah.
You will be surprised not only how God answers you within the internal dialogue of your thoughts and prayers, but when a Kyle Matthews shows up on your Marco Polo and starts to guide you through that, or someone will just say something that's random, and you're like, oh, that applies to me too. Or you're even on Instagram wasting away time trying to figure out your own identity, but you're numbing yourself, and boom, a motivational post actually like hits you right in the heart.
Sure.
And it's like, oh, but this goes back to last episode again.
Right.
When you're putting aside the time and you're turning aside and saying, God, where are you present in this?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
or
where the wrestling-
retrospective, right?
Mhm.
Like, where were you at helping?
Good.
As you mature in your faith, and you can go actually back to those hard times. Say, God, where were you in that? Where were you when I was hurt? Where were you when I felt alone? And I think that's something that if those are harder moments for you, that might be something that you want to do with a trusted mentor.
Yeah. Good.
Just something I'm sensing there. But all that to say, I think he'll be blown away by what he tells you.
Amen. One thing I'm thinking about here as well is when I start to get anxious and fearful of the circumstances, the outcomes that might happen with anything that I'm feeling called to or anything around my identity. One of the things that this passage has actually helped motivate me to remember is, Lord, someday I will look back on this moment of anxiety and fear and see what you were doing and see how you were providing. So help me to see that now. And that's exactly what this verse is doing.
Yep.
One day you'll come back on this mountain and you will worship me. You will praise me. And that is so comforting to my anxieties. It doesn't necessarily stop the bodily sensation of anxiety. It doesn't necessarily stop the mental doubts that I have, but does give me inspiration to make the next step.
Yep.
And the comfort to say, ooh, even though I feel this right now, I'm going to go forward.
Right.
And
Right. That's the pursuing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the ensuing of my identity.
Yes.
And so the call here, and I'm going to harken back to something just from a couple minutes ago, is to examine the ways that you have proclaimed your identity, right? I'm a Christian because, right? Anytime you might have ever been asked that, or even in the internal arguments you might have in your own head around, oh, if someone asks me this about my faith, I'm going to say this. I think our identity is being challenged by a verse like this to stop saying things like, it's based on what I do or believe. I'm a Christian because I'm convinced that God is with me through Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that he loves me, he pursued me, and continues to pursue me, and that's my identity now. And a response is, I love God and love my neighbor.
Yeah, sent and with concurrently in a way that only makes sense when you understand how God the Father interacts with us, and we take the time to deliberately see, okay, if I step above what I see around me, there's another plane there, and it helps orient ourselves into what this can look like, especially in the deeper topics of identity.
Yes. And one of the parts of my identity that I've come to grips with and part of my mission is to help us as Christians, and for those of you thinking about becoming a Christian, to recognize this very aspect of our identity, that it's his pursuit of us, not our pursuit of him. Our pursuit of him is so flimsy and comes up with identity questions and anxieties and fears and the other things that Moses is going to wrestle about. I literally think it's a calling here for the second half of my life,
right,
to help others understand this very aspect of our faith, is that it is meant to be founded on what he has done and continues to do.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be expressed solely in terms of what I do.
Yeah.
And how I respond to him. It's a proper response that shows these characteristics of him.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah. Again, this shows how well my son is at memorizing verses and how I need to catch up with my 5-year-old. Wow. But one of the first verses he memorized is we love because he first loved us. And you'll probably remember the verse before I do.
1 John 4,
there
but I don't know
the
verse,
But yeah, memorize verses with your children. They soak it up like a sponge. And I think that the same thing here. I think that sums up beautifully what you're articulating, and again points back to this journey and this development and the things that we learn about God, and through that the things that we learn about ourselves and interacting with the world, interacting with others. That's a journey that I'll tell you right now is worth going on. It is ultimately fulfilling, and in the larger question of identity, I guarantee you that's going to write a story worth watching.
Yeah, that's great. I want to close with a couple summarizing invitations and then the invitation that we typically end on. So hopefully as you've been listening to this, you can see that there are invitations to look in the mirror and look in the mirror deeply with this question of who am I, and take on those doubts, take on those anxieties, take on the things that bubble up. And that's part of this passage, is not to be perfect when it comes to identity making. It's to wrestle with it, right? So take a look in the mirror after this episode. Take some time and bring those doubts, bring those anxieties to God and see how he is with you, right?
Yep.
See how he's already with you and the promises he's made to be with you, and start to live into that worship aspect of all this as well.
Yeah.
Start to live into worshiping in the midst of your doubt, right? In the midst of the unfolding of your identity, like we talked about last episode. And worshiping him in doubt and in anxiety is the first step to seeing such glorious things come about in your life that will bear the fruit of your identity, bear the fruit of faithfulness, but it will be his fruit. And ultimately, that will only reinforce having our identity wrapped up in his presence with us, not in what we do, not in our personality traits, not in our accomplishments, not in our faithfulness, but his faithfulness to us. Any other invitations lingering in your mind, Kyle?
No, it's good. Glad to be on this journey with everyone.
Yeah, same here. And if you want a deeper dive on that idea of like all of this is initiated by his love, his faithfulness of us, his pursuit of us, go back to episode 1 of this podcast, season 1, episode 1. We do a deep dive there in the first impressions episode. So with that said, may you look in the mirror and see him with you and for you, and whether in doubt or hope, know you'll worship him again and again and again, not out of your faithfulness to him, but because of his great faithfulness towards you. Thanks for listening to the Invitation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, kindly invite others, see what I did there, Kyle, to listen in by sharing it with a friend, posting about it on social media, or even leaving a rating and a review.
To catch all the latest and greatest, give us a follow on Instagram, Facebook, or X at The Invitation Pod, and help us share the invitation with others. Thanks again. We hope you'll tune in to future episodes.
And that transitions us. Shoot. And that transitions. Why can't I say that word?
Take a lap.
I'm gonna go with segue.
Yeah.
Because apparently I can't say that word right now. And that segue. I can't say that word. What is going on? Now my face is gonna be all red.
Get it together.
Oh my gosh.
Where's the rock when you need him?
Right.
Focus!
Okay. I'm a Christian because I have been convinced.
Nice.
I'm a Really? And one thing, and this will be the last thing I'll say, I think. I say that a lot in this podcast.